The red-hot iron left a perfect mark on bare skin, a circle burned deep, stamped with the initials of an owner, placed carefully on the upper thigh where no short chitin could ever hide it. The girl did not scream. She had no tears left. At her feet, the stone floor of the Attican marketplace darkened with fresh blood. Just a few steps away, free citizens celebrated the triumphs of self-rule. It was the year 428 BC, the height of Aurelian Athens. That mark was not the punishment of a criminal. It was a brand of ownership. She was 13 years old, bought for less money than the price of a coarse loaf of grain. They say the body does not lie. And in classical Athens, the bodies of thousands of women told a story philosophers chose not to write. A story of a system that turned human flesh into property, sexual violence into law, and suffering into public revenue. A system so disturbing that Athens buried it in silence, written into statute, taxed by the state, and carefully ignored by the men who spoke endlessly about virtue. While Socrates spoke of moral excellence in shaded courtyards, while Pericles praised equality before the law, while playwrights composed tragedies about honor and human dignity, a few streets away the most organized and legally protected trade in female bodies in the ancient world operated in full daylight. And the most disturbing part wasn't that it existed. It was that no one questioned it. This is not the story of a queen or a fallen princess. It is the story of thousands of nameless women whose broken bodies financed the glory of Athens, whose pain paid for its temples, its theaters, and its democracy. To understand how the cradle of freedom became a hell for half its population, we have to descend into the parts of history philosophy books never wanted you to see. If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe to Sinister Empires. Hit the like button. And once you reach the moment that unsettles you most, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. To understand how sexual slavery became normal in Athens, we have to move backward in time to the early 6th century BC, when the reforms of Solonos laid the foundations of what would later be celebrated as democracy. These reforms are remembered as acts of liberation. Debt slavery among citizens was abolished. Political participation widened. Law replaced blood feuds. For free Athenian men, Solonos' reforms represented justice, balance, and order. But hidden inside those reforms was a fatal contradiction. The freedom of some citizens was built directly on the total enslavement of others. The laws carefully defined who counted as a person under the law, and who did not. Rights expanded, but only inward. Outside that boundary, absolute ownership remained untouched. And among all enslaved people, none were more exposed, more disposable, than the women forced into the sexual trade. The system itself was brutally simple, because it was meant to be efficient. Girls entered Athens through 3 main paths. Some were born enslaved, the daughters of women already prostituted, inheriting bondage before they could speak. Others were taken during the city's constant wars of expansion, absorbed as spoils of conquest. But most commonly, they were sold by their own families when hunger, debt, and despair erased any remaining choice. Poverty did not excuse the sale. It justified it. There was no minimum age. Surviving records mention girls as young as 8 being prepared for use, trained before their bodies had even matured. Other documents show higher prices paid for those who had not yet begun menstruation, treated as rarer, more valuable commodities precisely because of their youth. Once purchased, they were taken to the ergostai, specialized workshops where human beings were sorted like livestock. Bodies were examined. Teeth, skin, posture, obedience. The most beautiful were assigned to elite gatherings, where conversation and performance mattered almost as much as sex. Those judged average were sent to brothels near the harbor, and those deemed ugly, weak, or sick were pushed into the most degraded districts of the Kerameikon, where any man could use them for the price of a coarse loaf of bread. But every one of them, without exception, was branded with hot iron. The pain was intentional. The scar was permanent. It carried a single message. This body does not belong to you. It never has. It never will. Their owners did not call them women. They called them andrapida, men's feet, a term that reduced human beings to walking tools. Under Solonos's law, killing a sexual slave carried the same penalty as destroying a plow, a fine paid to the owner for damaged property. There was no legal concept of rape against them, because in the eyes of the law, they lacked the capacity to consent or to refuse. Their only function was to receive. Their only identity was availability. The Athenian state did not merely tolerate this trade. It organized it. Brothels required licenses. Every sexual transaction was taxed. Officials known as astynomoi were appointed to inspect enslaved women regularly, ensuring they remained fit for use. These inspections were not moral judgments. They were quality control. If a woman became ill, she was removed until she recovered or died. If she became pregnant, the fetus was aborted using methods that frequently killed her as well. If she aged or lost her appeal, she was sold downward through lower establishments until she ended on the streets, begging, gambling, and prostituting herself for scraps of food. Tax records reveal the scale of the system. Between 15 and 20% of the city-state's revenue came from the sexual trade. That money funded public buildings, religious festivals, theatrical performances, and even the schools where philosophers lectured about virtue and human dignity. The same democracy that praised equality depended financially on systematic exploitation. The paradox was complete. Wisdom was paid for with blood. Beauty was built on pain. Freedom rested on invisible chains. And as if economic exploitation were not enough, Aurelian Athens went further. It found a way to transform sexual violence itself into sacred ritual during the great Diae, the festivals honoring Dionysus, god of wine and fertility. Enslaved women were not merely used during these celebrations. They were offered as living sacrifices in ceremonies that lasted entire days, turning collective violation into divine worship. It was early spring, for 123 BC Athens glowed with torchlight, masks, and wine. The great Diae had begun, the city's most important festival. Fertility, theater, and renewal were celebrated openly. Citizens crowded into performances by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, watching tragedies that explored justice, fate, and the dignity of the human soul. Yet behind this cultural brilliance, darker rituals unfolded. Ancient sources describe Dionysian ceremonies blending ecstatic worship, performance, and symbolic fertility rites. Enslaved women and those bound temples participated under rigid structures that erased all personal will. For 5 days, Athens lived a disturbing double life. Art reached its highest expression, while religion justified hierarchy, domination, and symbolic human sacrifice. What citizens experienced as divine communion, the victims endured as silence. And so, while tragedies about compassion and justice played on stage, customs that denied those very ideals were carried out just beyond the theater walls. The Athenian contradiction stood exposed. The city of reason and art sustained itself through practices that turned faith into an instrument of control. Yet even this ritualized brutality was not the most terrifying feature of the system. The true horror lay elsewhere. Sexual slavery was not a side effect of Athenian democracy. It was its quiet economic engine. Every vote cast in the assembly, every speech delivered in the Attican agora, every sculpture and temple adorning the Acropolis, all of it was paid for, at least in part, by the systematic suffering of women reduced to commodities. Fragments of tax records preserved on papyrus and pottery shards reveal the scale. In the port of Piraeus alone, more than 200 officially registered brothels operated, employing nearly 8,000 enslaved women. Each establishment paid an annual license equal to half a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Every sexual act was taxed at 10%, collected directly from clients through tokens sold by state officials. But money was only the beginning, because this system did not operate in isolation. It pulled the entire city into its orbit. And that is where the story grows even darker. The system did not function alone. It drew nearly every layer of Athenian society into its machinery, not as passive observers, but as active participants. Enslaved laborers built and repaired the brothels, scrubbing blood from stone floors before dawn. Artisans forged locks, shackles, and restraint devices designed not for one use, but for repetition. Physicians performed abortions and treated venereal disease, not to heal, but to return bodies to circulation. Priests consecrated rites that transformed exploitation into obligation. Magistrates supervised inspections with tablets in hand. Citizens worked openly as procurers. Even free Attican women sometimes served as overseers, enforcing discipline on younger enslaved girls they did not regard as their equals. No part of the city existed outside the system. Everyone knew where the money came from. The placement of the brothels was deliberate. The largest and most expensive establishments clustered around the central agora, allowing citizens to visit them after voting, debating, or delivering speeches. Politics ended. Consumption began. Mid-priced houses surrounded the harbor, where foreign merchants spent wealth that would never return home. The cheapest operated in artisan quarters, where laborers and urban slaves paid meager sums for access to women already broken by exhaustion, illness, and fear. Each tier followed a pricing structure carefully regulated by the state. Not negotiated, not improvised, but enforced. A night with a first-category slave, young, attractive, trained in music and conversation, cost the equivalent of 3 days' wages for a citizen soldier. Second-category women were priced like a full meal at a respectable tavern. Third-category women were rented for the cost of a cup of diluted wine. Those who were sick, elderly, or pregnant were offered free of charge to anyone willing to use them. This was framed as a public service, subsidized by the state, a final extraction from bodies no longer profitable. The law protected this system with meticulous care. Owners and clients were shielded from consequence, while any act of resistance was criminalized. A woman who refused a client could be publicly whipped to discourage imitation. One who attempted escape was branded on the face, a permanent warning, and sold into arenas where public violation became part of spectacle. A woman who struck a client, even in self-defense, could be executed immediately, without testimony, without trial, without record. Yet the law also imposed disturbing protection for the enslaved themselves, revealing the system's true logic. It was forbidden to permanently injure them without the owner's consent. It was forbidden to kill them without compensation. It was forbidden to steal them or use them without paying the required fees. In other words, Aurelian law protected sexual slaves exactly as it protected livestock, tools, and land. Not because they were human, but because they held market value. All of this unfolded while the greatest philosophers in recorded history debated justice, virtue, and a good life just steps away from markets selling human bodies. Socrates taught that wisdom began with acknowledging ignorance, yet he never publicly challenged a system that reduced half the population to instruments of use. Plato imagined an ideal state ruled by philosopher kings while accepting slavery as a necessary condition to free citizens from labor. Aristotle defined humans as political beings and argued that some people, especially women and foreigners, were slaves by nature, claiming that using them sexually was as natural as using tools to build walls. The contradiction was not accidental. It was structural. The democratic system of Attic Athens, built on the promise of equal participation among free men, functioned only because the majority of labor, physical, emotional, and sexual, was delegated to people without rights, voice, or legal existence. The freedom of some rested entirely on the absolute unfreedom of others. And among all the enslaved, women forced into the sexual trade were the most exposed, the least protected, and the easiest to erase. Most did not live beyond 23. Their bodies were destroyed by years of repeated violence, untreated disease, forced abortions performed with crude instruments, and the psychological damage of an existence reduced to function. When resistance finally ceased, the system had already prepared for their disappearance. There were no cemeteries for them, no funeral rites, no mourning families, no names carved in stone. Disposal was the owner's responsibility, handled as cheaply as possible. Most bodies were dumped into the Veratheon, a deep pit outside the city where executed criminals dead slaves, and animal remains were discarded. There, mixed with refuse and ash, thousands of women dissolved into anonymous oil. Others were sold even after death to medical schools, where students practiced dissections. Physicians believed that the bodies of heavily used women offered better anatomical knowledge than those of virgins or respected matrons. Even in death, their flesh continued to serve the intellectual progress of the civilization that had destroyed them. But the most chilling fate awaited those who survived past usefulness. As age erased their value, they were pushed into the lowest tier of the system. Illegal brothels hidden in cellar basements, where men paid with coins or scraps of food. Conditions were so brutal that death was often a release. Later moral writers, recording fragments centuries afterward, preserved glimpses of what happened in these places. Women in their 40s, toothless, diseased, exhausted, were raped by groups of adolescent boys as initiation rituals. Others, blind, deaf, or mutilated, were rented at reduced prices as defective merchandise. And even this was not the end of the system's cruelty. Children born inside it faced something worse still. Pregnant women gave birth in the same rooms where they worked, on the same floors, under the same roofs, sometimes between clients, so that daughters could be absorbed immediately into the trade without ever experiencing a free childhood. There was no separation between birth and bondage. Life began already assigned a price. And throughout this entire machinery of exploitation, Athenian society maintained a level of hypocrisy that exposes the depth of its moral decay. The same legal system that ferociously guarded the sexual purity of citizen women, daughters, wives, and mothers of citizens, imposing death penalties on anyone who violated them, simultaneously legalized and normalized the sexual enslavement of everyone else. An Athenian citizen who violated the wife of another citizen could be killed instantly by the wronged husband without trial. That same man could assault 100 enslaved women in a single night and still return to the assembly the next morning as a respectable participant in civic life. The division was not merely legal. It was moral, and it was religious. Citizen women were treated as sacred vessels because their sexual purity preserved the legitimacy of citizen bloodlines. Sexual slaves were treated as necessary waste outlets because their availability was believed to protect that purity, redirecting male desire away from women whose offspring mattered. Desire itself was never condemned. It was simply redirected downward. The virtue of some was sustained entirely through the absolute degradation of others. This logic found its most polished expression in the philosophy of the age. Aristandros of Stagira argued that the difference between a wife and a sexual slave was the same as the difference between a musical instrument and a work tool. Both were useful, but for entirely different purposes. A wife, he claimed, was like a lyre, meant to produce harmony within the household and beauty in offspring. A sexual slave was like a hammer, meant to satisfy basic needs without affecting the quality of the primary work. Pleasure without consequence. Use without responsibility. And while philosophers refined these distinctions, while statesmen debated justice and virtue in the civic assembly, while playwrights composed tragedies about fate, honor, and human dignity, every day, in every licensed brothel across Attica, nameless women deteriorated. Their bodies broke first. Their minds followed. And only physical death finally released them from an existence that had never truly been life, only function. Centuries later, when Christian emperors shut the last legal brothels, when the final sexual slaves died in obscurity, when the system that had consumed them collapsed into dust, the monuments built with their suffering still remained. The Parthenon, eternal symbol of Greek beauty and wisdom, had been financed in part through taxes levied on their pain. The theater of Dionysian, where the most celebrated tragedies in human history were performed, had also served as a backdrop for some of the most systematic ritualized sexual violence the ancient world ever produced. Even now, 25 centuries later, millions walk among these ruins without knowing what paid for them. They admire the perfection of white marble without ever asking how much blood purchased it. They celebrate Greek philosophy without ever questioning how theories of human dignity were developed alongside the routine dehumanization of half the population. This is the truth history prefers not to confront. There is no innocent beauty when it is built on suffering. There is no pure wisdom when it coexists with brutality. There is no civilization worthy of admiration when it reserves humanity for only some. Classical Hellenic Athens gave the world democracy, philosophy, theater, and architecture that shaped Western thought. But it also delivered the clearest proof that humanity's greatest achievements can exist beside its most extreme crimes, and that the capacity for beauty is inseparable from the capacity for cruelty. This is not the story of a fallen princess or a ruler undone by desire. It is the story of thousands of women who lost their humanity so a civilization could preserve its glory. It is a story of bodies burned with iron so other bodies could be immortalized in marble. It is a story of voices erased forever so other voices could echo through history. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it is written by the executioners. For more than 2,000 years, the story of Athens has been told by those who praised its greatness while ignoring its violence, who admired its wisdom while forgetting its cruelty, who venerated its legacy while erasing its victims. Today, every time the cradle of democracy is invoked, every time the so-called Greek miracle is celebrated, every time Athenian philosophy is taught as the foundation of Western civilization, it is worth remembering that this miracle carried a cost. And that cost was paid with the bodies and lives of thousands of women whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose voices we will never hear, but whose story deserves to be told. Civilizations do not die when their temples fall. They die when their moral contradictions become impossible to sustain. Athens was not destroyed by outsiders. It was undone by a system that demanded the absolute enslavement of many to preserve the freedom of a few, where beauty for some required the total degradation of others, where the humanity of a chosen class was built on the dehumanization of multitudes. And if this account has unsettled you, if something in you resists the hypocrisy that allowed wisdom to coexist with cruelty, ask yourself how many similar contradictions we tolerate today. How many achievements are built on suffering we choose not to see? How much beauty do we admire without questioning its cost? Because only when buried truths are exposed do silenced voices speak again. And only by listening to those erased from history can we begin to understand what it truly means to be human. If you reach the end of this descent, write "remembered" in the comments, so we know you walk with us through the entire shadow. Sinister Empires tells the stories history tried to bury.